Professor Salah Hassan, who is the director here of the Africana Studies Research Center, Goldwin Smith, Professor of Art History at Cornell, who's well known, I'm sure, to all of you. Also, Carina Ray, who's no stranger to the Africana Center, who spent, I think, more time here at the Africana Center than she did in McGraw Hall while she was working on her PhD degree in history. She has a manuscript, Policing Sexual Boundaries, the Politics of Race in Colonial Ghana. She's assistant professor of history at Fordham University, where she teaches Black and African Atlantic history. And I want to thank her 2 years ago now, I guess it was, when I gave a presentation at the Du Bois Center in Ghana to look up and see a familiar face. It was really wonderful. So, Professors Hassan and Ray.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for showing, and I actually want to thank everybody in this room for coming here today rather than going to Cornell president or Cornell provost, who called suddenly for a faculty forum and picked up of all the days today to compete with our book launch. But anyway, thank you so much. Basically, we wanted to say a few words, and I think we will be alternately basically interjecting views and reading different sections from the book. But we want to start first with what is really important to do, which is to say that this is a collaborative project. It's a project that involves working on two levels: the level of the publication itself, and then the conference that actually preceded the publication. And the conference was done collaboratively between the Africana Studies Research Center and the Institute for Ethiopian Studies at the University of Addis Ababa. It's a model of collaboration that we really want to pursue that actually between American institutions and African institutions is a two-way model. We felt it was a two-way street and not colonial or a new colonial type of so-called academic exchange in which the West always end up beneficial. And I say this because since we started the collaboration with the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, we've done two conferences. We did a conference called Imaging Ethiopia, Monarchy and Modernity, and we did that here, and that brought about 7 scholars through a grant from Prince Claus Fund to Cornell here, and the result of that will also be another book that is coming out soon, most likely with Prestel, which is a very major art publisher. This one happened the other way around, is that we actually did it in Ethiopia, and Addis symbolically provided a lot of opportunities. First, it's in an African soil, and it's about an African problem that basically captured the imagination and the attention of millions of people. Addis is also symbolic for us as Sudanese, and I'm saying here, speaking on behalf of the Sudanese, is that Addis was the place where the first peace agreement in 1971 was also signed. That is the peace agreement to solve another issue, which is South-North, before Darfur crisis started. There are two key people I must thank for this collaboration on the Ethiopian side. That is Professor Andreas Eshete, who is the president of the University of Addis Ababa, who welcomed us warmly, generously, opened up the door for us there, and facilitated many logistics for the conference. And the second person is a colleague, Elizabeth Georges. She is hiding her face here. She's the director of the Institute for Ethiopian Studies. And I say proudly, she's also now almost a Cornell alumni PhD. And I want to congratulate her today for defending her dissertation. And with great success, she worked with me, Susan Bakmors, and Iftikhar Dad in art history, and she wrote really a wonderful dissertation, and I must say it will be an original contribution in African art history. It is called Ethiopian Modernism, a Subaltern Perspective. And that can show you how, since she came to Cornell, she absorbs theory like a sponge and apply. Okay, anyway, enough with that. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Ethiopia also facilitated something significant for us, which is the issue of visa. Many of the participants, and this is something that we will emphasize over and over again about this book, an important aspect, there is predominantly Sudanese scholars who contributed to this book. And I know very well that is many of them would not have been given visa to the United States because of their activist background, because some of them also have leftist leaning. And you know, in embassies today, the question of have you ever been a member of the Communist Party is still there. Anyway, some of them are also rebel leaders, and rebel leaders in the sense that these are the intellectuals who represent some of the Darfur movement. And there are actually very interesting and entertaining stories that happened, because one of them, in fear of the visa, he said he must be allowed to travel. He must be allowed to make his own travel arrangement because he's residing in Ireland. He's a professor of anthropology there. And he said he wants to make sure that the flight goes directly to Ethiopia because he's wanted by the Sudanese government. His picture and name is well known because he's in the leadership. And we said, fine, make your own arrangement. Guess what? He made an arrangement without looking at the ticket through KLM, and the first stop is Khartoum before it landed in Addis. Luckily, he was not recognized, so he stayed. He said he was reading a newspaper all the time, hiding his face. So he made it. Let me just mention something about the funding. There are many units at Cornell really helped us a great with this, but I also must mention that the bulk part of the funding came from the Prince Claus Fund for Culture and Development in the Netherlands. They gave us a very generous grant that covered this, and they usually always insist on, sorry, Grant, I hope the child is okay. They insist on always projects that really benefit the continent and happen in the continent. So that's one of the rare foundations that does that. So we are grateful for that. But at Cornell, the Society for the Humanities, Afrikaans, of course, Vice Provost for International Studies, journalists, they gave us a grant, Dean of Art and Science, and also Fordham University, where my colleague Carina works, Dean of Faculty, and also Head of the History Department gave us also generous funding. We must thank so many others, among them, of course, and most important are the participant, the keynote speakers, Dr. Mansour Khalid from Sudan, who was a very important and high-ranking official in the Sudan People Liberation Army, and also Mahmoud Mamdani, who gave a keynote speak, and who is a very well-known contributor or somebody who is in the discourse on Darfur today, figure prominently with his views and contributions, especially his latest book on what he called humanitarian fundamentalism. Many other scholars also helped us in other ways. Translation. We also insisted that we should not prevent people or make it an obstacle for people who don't write in English. So a lot of great scholars don't write in English. Not everybody writes in English. So there are several people who wrote in Arabic. We made sure that we facilitate also their translation into English, and that was also important. There's several people who help us with translating documents, original documents, and that is something we'll mention, that the book, almost half of it are original documents that are rare to find and useful for research on Darfur. On the Ethiopian side, there were so many scholars that Elizabeth Georges and Andreas Ashete made sure that they will be part of this kind of contribution. They really engaged with us, and that was another also useful exchange. It was good for the Sudanese in the audience and the Ethiopian in the audience to have an exchange about all of those. So, of course, there are a set of many other people that one must thank: Cornell University Press, the designers who contributed to the design of the book itself, which made it really a wonderful book, elegant, and one must not say really beautiful in the context of a Darfur crisis, but I think it was done in a way that is also readable and not too artistic, and that was also a concern for us. Although we made sure that it also involved a lot of photography, and we must thank one of the Sudanese photographers, whom we will mention later on in the text. So I hope I didn't take too long, Carina, so I give you the...
I also just wanted to acknowledge Professor Grant Farrad, who I think maybe he just stepped outside because he's actually one of the contributors to our book, and he's actually here. And he was with us in Ethiopia, and so because there are, unfortunately, not that many of our contributors here today, I really wanted to acknowledge Grant and thank him for his contribution to the book. We also wanted to sort of start off by saying a few words about what brought us to this particular project. And so I would just briefly say that for me, in many ways, this book project marries a very long-standing personal and political commitment that I've had since my early teens to activism around important African issues. So as a young teenager, I got really involved in the anti-apartheid movement in Southern California. And then later on, I obviously have developed a sort of intellectual commitment to knowledge production around Africa. But this piece, or this volume, really brings those two trajectories of my life together. And it was really, in that way, a pleasure to be able to work on something that was, at the same time, very difficult. It was not an easy book to bring into being, in part just because the conflict itself is so intractable and very difficult to understand, and then all of the sort of complexities of bringing so many people together. And so I think it's really the sort of passion that I have, both personally and professionally, that allowed me to do that. And then the other thing I just wanted to start off by saying was that I had a conversation earlier in September. I think it was one of my colleagues who said to me, and this was right around the time when Martin Agwe, who's the UN commander for the hybrid AU-UN force in Darfur, had sort of just like unilaterally declared that the war is over. And this colleague said to me, oh, so well, how does it feel to, publish a book basically and have it come out like on the day that, the thing is declared over? And I thought this raised a couple of issues. One, and I think we both very much agree on this, is that you never do a book like this because you're looking to capitalize on a human tragedy, for one, right? So it's, in fact, we would be, more than happy if that were really the case, if this conflict were really over. But I think in many ways the book is a meditation on not only what happened on the ground and really trying to bring a number of different perspectives together to actually begin to understand the complexities of what happened, what didn't happen. It's also a meditation on how people understood it, right? There was, I think, in part, one of the reasons that this conflict, in some ways had and the amount of attention was in some ways disproportionate to what was actually going on over the course of a very long period of time on the ground, is because so many different people from different quarters have taken up that issue. And so the book is also a reflection on how it's been taken up. And so in that sense, I think the book is relevant, will remain relevant, and of course it's our hope that that not only the situation in Darfur itself can have a resolution, but also that the situation in Sudan itself can have a resolution, because ultimately the practices that gave birth to the conflict in Darfur are in many ways still operating on the ground in Sudan.
I will just add that it's for me, as a Sudanese, I was very troubled by the nature of activism around Sudan. And especially around the issue of Darfur, where I felt like this never really speaks for the Sudanese condition, especially knowing and growing up in Sudan that it is one of those countries that has one of the strongest civil society, probably in the continent and the Middle East. It has a very engaged public with the opposing the policy of the government, and it's also a highly organized opposition. So when you really look at the things from this side of the Atlantic, looking back at Africa, you would think that Sudan is just a place where just total victimization, where nobody's really able to speak, and it requires other people to speak on their behalf. What came to mind is also a comparison between the nature of activism around Darfur, like Save Darfur movement, and earlier movement that I encountered when I came to the United States as a student in the 1980s at the University of Pennsylvania, where at that time, the anti-apartheid movement was at its climax. And at that time, this was a movement that was a highly progressive, highly engaged with all issues of justice, that is not full of this contradiction that you see today with Save Darfur movement, which is only focusing on Darfur, but you don't see the same groups, which is actually predominantly mostly right-wing organizations, that is not engaged in all other issues of justice. The anti-apartheid movement differ in two senses. One is that it was dominated by the South African voice, meaning the African National Congress determined the issues, whether it's sanctions on South Africa, whether it's a boycott. But in the context of Darfur, there was no Sudanese voice. You would think that no Sudanese are articulate or no Sudanese are actually engaged in the issue of Darfur. While knowing Sudan, there are definitely many organizations, as you see from just some of the readings that we'll do from our own sections that we wrote for the book, that there is actually a highly articulate group of Sudanese, very many organizations in Sudan that are not just involved in politics of protest and resistance to the government, but also articulating solutions. And that actually, the whole second part of the book is actually document that speak to those kind of facts. So if you can proceed with the
Okay. And I actually will beg your pardon because I am definitely not very talented when it comes to, can you hear me? Yeah. So I'm not very talented when it comes to producing PowerPoints. So I will apologize for the lack of grace of this particular PowerPoint. But just also, this is just our acknowledgement in writing the book to the people of Darfur and to all Sudanese who are aspiring for a democratic and united Sudan. And we started off the introduction to the book, which is called Critically Reading Darfur and the Crisis of Governance in Sudan. That's the title of the introduction. With this particular quote on violence, because we felt it really sort of captured the nuanced understanding that we were trying to bring to understanding the specific violence in Darfur. And so I just wanted to read it. Violence can never be understood solely in terms of its physicality, force, assault, or the infliction of pain alone. Violence also includes assaults on the personhood, dignity, sense of worth, or value of the victim. The social and cultural dimensions of the violence are what give violence its power and meaning. Focusing exclusively on the physical aspects of torture, terror, violence misses the point and transforms the project into a clinical, literary, and artistic exercise, which runs the risk of degenerating into a theater or pornography of violence in which the voyeuristic impulse subverts the larger project of witnessing, critiquing, and writing against violence, injustice, and suffering. So we hope that the book does justice to this particular quote. And it was because we wanted to be able to encapsulate the complexity of this particular conflict that we brought together so many people in Ethiopia from different perspectives, and I think that Salah already sort of spoke to that, so I don't need to really go over it too much. But I just wanted to note that even with such a diverse group of presenters from various walks of life and with different political orientations, a clear consensus was ultimately reached that the root cause of this particular conflict lies at the doorstep of the failed Sudanese state. And so I think if there's one conclusion that we have reached at the end of this particular volume, it's that. And again, it's why addressing the larger issue of the Sudanese state is so important in understanding the particular instance of Darfur. So I think you wanted to say a word about terminology.
I want to say a few words about terminology and struggling with those issues, because what I did really discover is that sometimes editing is probably more difficult than really authoring your own or single author books, because it involves, besides managing a lot of individuals, managing a lot of essays from different perspectives, written from different disciplines or disciplinary perspective, and especially this book, as you can see from the list of the contributors, which we'll highlight when we get to just run you through the book itself, that they include scholars, they include activists. So many of them actually are not really trained academically to think through terminology in a way that is we are asked always to be rigorous about terms. So the terminology becomes important because also in this context, it also involves translation. And in translation also, the issue of terminology becomes problematic. So there are several editorial issues that surface in relation to terminology for us. Names, concepts used throughout the different essays included, of course, in this book. And some of these issues are just a matter of inconsistent, which is editorial and easy to deal with, whether it's consistency in names, because there's always Sudan, there's Darfur, Darfuri, Darfurians. So there's a lot of difficulties like that, but we resolve them by just reaching some consensus about those. But the most challenging for us has been encountering terms we ourselves would not employ in our own work because of their conceptual, intellectually problematic histories, meanings, and usage. A good example of this is tribe, a term that has been subjected to much needed criticism within anthropological and social sciences discourses. For well over 3 decades, Africanists have been debated and the uses and abuses of the word tribe. One of the earliest critiques of the term came from the great South African anthropologist and Pan-Africanist Archie Mafeje, who in 1971 argued that if tribalism is thought of as peculiarly African, then ideology itself is particularly European in origin. Later, generations of scholars have gone on to show how, in many instances, so-called tribes were indeed colonial creations and thereby question the efficacy of using tribe as a unit of analysis when studying African societies. While today few Africanists use tribe in their scholarship and teaching, it is still rampant in public discourse about Africa, particularly in the Western media coverage of conflict in Africa. Slapping the word tribal on African conflict is not only analytically lazy, but irresponsible and dangerous. Deeply embedded in a colonial lexicon of racism, the use of such inaccurate terminology naturalizes and further exoticizes violence in Africa in ways that preclude a true understanding of the root causes and manifestations of violence, and forecloses the possibility of generating more informed prospect for just and comprehensive resolutions to violent conflicts. This could not be more evident than in the case of Darfur, as many of the essays included in this volume illustrate. The use of tribe in the context of Darfur is especially troubling because it gives the wrong-headed impression that the conflict is rooted in primordial identities. The casual use of the term tribe obscures rather than clarifies our understanding of how ethnic identities and groups have evolved and interacted with one another over time and in relation to such factors as the state and class formation, economic, social, political, and political change, environmental factors, as well as more mundane facts of life such as migration and intermarriage. While there is no doubt that ethnic tensions, which have a long history in Darfur, have affected how the violence has unfolded, to characterize the violence as tribal or race war, neither speak to the ethnic dimensions of the conflict, of the violence, nor to other important factors such as unequal access to political and economic power that have coalesced to bring about this unprecedented wave of destruction at this particular moment. Nor does it acknowledge the leading role that violent conflict play in concretizing previously fluid categories. Nor does it acknowledge the leading role that violent conflicts play in concretizing previously fluid categories of ethnic identity and creating new forms of ethnic affiliations, which in turn can intensify existing conflict or become fodder for future ones. And indeed, that's the situation in Darfur. It's not about primordial tribal war. It is something that came out of a specific history of a violent intervention from the state, of a fluid identity prior to that, of other identity that I would call pre-modern, that are actually mobilized in the context of a modern warfare. I think you're...
I mean, we have a larger discussion of some of the other problematic terminologies in the introduction, but I think that suffices. So actually, before we go through the contents of the book, and we're going to go through it rather rapidly, I just wanted to say a bit about the visual essay that accompanies the text and is interspersed after each of the sections in the book. It's interspersed in the first part of the book. And we're really fortunate to have a very accomplished Sudanese photographer, Isam Abdul Hafiz, who actually went into Darfur during the conflict and basically covertly photographed quite extensively. And he was very generous in giving us the images and allowing us to use them in the book. And so his photographs, which capture the sorrow, resilience, and hope of Darfurians, perhaps best symbolize our commitment to bringing a human face to the conflict by showing Darfurians in the full complexity of their lives, rather than as a monolithic entity whose victimization is the only salient component of their identities, as is often the case in the widely circulating existing visual images of the conflict in Darfur. With few exceptions, the typical Western media representation of Darfur and its people has shifted between what has come to be known in current discourses of visual anthropology as a pornography of violence on the one hand and miserabilism on the other hand. The focus has been on the victimization, grotesqueness, and horror of the war, with an emphasis on showing victims when they are at their most vulnerable. We are not in any way suggesting we are not in any way suggesting that such images should be censored or hidden. However, the oversaturation of such images runs the risk of having a numbing effect on the public who are bombarded by such imagery, and in the process normalizing the victim's pain and suffering. They also reinforce the stereotype of Africa as the quote-unquote heart of darkness, where violence becomes a normalized aspect of the state of nature associated with the so-called primitive natives, right? And I think that if you really look at the visual images that accompanied reportage on the war, not only just in Darfur, but across the continent, you'll see that there is this sort of pornography of violence in the kind of liberal use of these images. And so we hope that or we feel strongly that the visual images that are included in this book really give a representative portrayal of what is actually happening on the ground.
Okay,
So,
I think at this juncture we would like to just walk you through the book quickly and just give you an idea about the different sections. And also in the process itself, you understand, we will give you an idea about the different sections and how we divided the book, and also give you an idea about the design itself, which is very helpful in outlining the different contexts,
Okay.
the different sections. Sorry.
So, I mean, here we'll just start with part one. So the first section of part one is on the origins and evolution of the conflict. And you'll see we have quite a number of different pieces which address a range of different issues. One of the ones that I thought was particularly important was the one by Yango Bore, who has typically written on the South, and I thought it was very important to bring a Southern perspective into the book and to look at the conflict in Darfur vis-a-vis what's happening in Southern Sudan as well. So that was, I thought, a particularly important one. His was marginalization in the war from the South to Darfur.
I think we can, because that will help you see that. I thought
Oh.
I have it.
Okay,
Okay.
yeah.
So this is the first section itself, and I think
Right,
just
sorry,
what I
thanks.
would like to add also, that some of you may not know these people, but it's interesting, what we insisted on is really bringing different perspectives, so not insisting on just one view. For example, Abdullah Ismail Tom is a leader in the justice and equality movement. He's basically their PR person. He's the anthropologist that I talked about earlier in the joke about ending up traveling through Khartoum. He brings in, of course, a Darfuri perspective, which is also a contested, perspective, even within Darfur itself, because he seemed to fall sometime into the racialization too much and ignoring some of the socioeconomic factors, which actually created a lot of debate within the conference itself. Ali Dinar is also from Darfur, a scholar, who's actually also a descendant of one of the sultans of the founder of the kingdom of Darfur. Not to say that that makes you a good scholar, but at least it's interesting that he is also comes from that region. Atal Batahani is a scholar from the University of Khartoum, a political scientist, while Mansour Khalid is a very well-known Sudanese intellectual who actually at some point was a minister of foreign affairs, later on joined the Sudan People Liberation Army, which is the main southern group. And that also shows a lot of interesting complexity because in Sudan, the Sudan People Liberation Army is always perceived as a southern front. But it is interesting to see a Sudanese also at the level of the leader, sorry, a northern Sudanese at the level of the leadership of it and a major spokesperson for the movement. And that also just gives you some of the nuances of the Sudanese, political spectrum, where there's always this dichotomies and arbitrary divisions that you see in the media, north-south, east-west, without realizing that actually there are dynamic movements that sometimes intersect and overlap across Sudan itself, and shows how healthy and interesting and dynamic civil society has been, and for a long time.
So these are some of the images that accompany that particular section.
This is after a raid by a group that is militias that are part of a government or in a village, that he happened to be their photographer. These are very interesting pictures that show some of the dynamic, because one is a soldier and one is from the so-called Arabized groups or Arab groups within Darfur. Basically, they are nomads, so horses are very important in that. But it shows sometimes this kind of dynamics of the government with the Arabized group, which is basically one of the major, like at least interpretation of the war in Darfur is that it is a counter-insurgency on the cheap. That it is basically a government that is using one group or ethnic group against the other in a counter-insurgency type of war that is a surrogate war rather than really a war that is just about groups that are fighting each other for no reason.
So the next section is called Representations of the War in Darfur. And we had and actually this one, we decided to republish two very key essays that were already in circulation. So we had Who Are the Darfurians by Alex DeWall, and then I'm sure probably the one thing that most people are familiar with, which is Mamdani's The Politics of Naming, which was in the London Review of Books and sort of generated a lot of discussion in the United States around what was happening in terms of activism on the Darfur issue. And then we both had our particular contributions in this section as well. And so we thought we might take a few minutes apiece to say something about the writing that we did for the book apart from the editorial work.
Just before we get into that, I thought I should add that Alex DeWall is actually a major scholar on the issue of Darfur. He wrote one of the first books, and his essay, Counterinsurgency on the Cheap, is one of the first to correct really the misconceptions about the essence of war in Darfur and the origin of it, shifting it from this environmental degradation, tribal war, racialized war, into a war that is in which the state has been implicated, which is something that was absent from many of these debates, and even from the discourses of Save Darfur movement itself. So the politics of naming dealt with the representation of the war from a Western perspective, and especially from a United States perspective. It's a major key essay that basically also shifted and provided a major critique for Save Darfur movement and for the movement in solidarity with Darfur, comparing it with the Iraqi war and how there are all these larger geopolitical dynamics that actually basically dictate some of the tactics and the strategies of the Save Darfur movement and shifted the focus really from the real essence, shifting it into a racialized war. So he was very key in kind of explaining this. And his book, basically, Saviors and Survivors, evolved out of that major essay. So we felt providing this essay would be very helpful.
And I mean, I think also it's, important to, when I think about the relationship between this essay, the conference, and then the book that came out. I mean, Mamdani was really engaged by participants at the conference in Addis. I mean, seriously engaged, seriously challenged, and I think that particular moment was really important for him to have to wrestle with the multiplicity of different perspectives that Darfurians and Sudanese were expressing.
You want to go ahead?
No, you can.
Okay. What I just decided to do is just to read you one paragraph. I'm not going to bore you with more. I mean, buy the book and read it. But I'll give you just one paragraph. And this is actually one of the major really reasons that caused me to write this specific essay. And I was actually troubled, as I said, by the representation of the war. A typical example, and I wish we had time, I could have played part of that video, is a famous 60-minute documentary called Searching for Jacob. So this is just, I took it as a typical example of the representation of the war within this essay. I said, and I quote myself here, a typical example of Darfur advocacy and coverage in the media is the documentary Searching for Jacob, features on CBS 60 Minutes program, where the victim voice was marginal to the arduous efforts and journey of the reporter, Scott Pelley, and his companion, a Western NGO expert advocate. Rather than providing a platform for the victim, whose real name is Yaqub, not Jacob, to tell his own story, the program is fixated on the grueling search for him. From the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles to a remote and inaccessible internally displaced camp in Darfur. This phenomenon is, of course, deeply rooted in the Western media's representation of Africans and non-Western people in general as helpless, inarticulate, and unable to voice their own concerns, hence the need for the Westerner as a ventriloquist savior to speak on their behalf. Moreover, in a country such as Sudan, known for its vibrant civil society and the visible presence of a highly articulate intellectual and activists, academics, lawyers, economists, and so forth, within the leadership actually of Darfur resistance movement, there is no justification for refusing to allow Sudanese to speak for themselves. So intimately related to this issue is, of course, the visual representation of Darfur, its people and landscape in Western media, which has projected Darfurians as victims with no regard for their perseverance, resilience, and resourcefulness. And that's why the presentation of the images by Assam Abdul Hafiz was very important and key for us in countering that kind of representation. That it shows some of the atrocities, but it also shows the perseverance and resilience of Darfuri themselves, and present them as people who actually are resilient people, people who resist, rather than just victim in their own, and also present them in a humane way.
Okay. In my piece, I did a massive survey of the way in which Darfur was covered in the African press. And it entailed, I don't even want to count how many articles I read, and I went through and tried to essentially look at what were the main themes that were coming out. And what I want to underscore here is, if I can find it. Oh, is this not the book that I marked in? Sorry.
It's okay.
Here it is. Sorry. Take that. There we go. What I found particularly interesting, and one of the major themes that came out to me, was the way in which the African press was also using a very oversimplified, racialized language to talk about the conflict, which in many ways revealed an anti-Arab bias, often constructing Darfur so-called Arabs as foreigners. And I didn't go so much into that because other essays in the volume really unpack that. But what I had wanted to do was to highlight the way in which the complexity has been largely reduced in the pages of many African newspapers to a narrative of good versus evil, African versus Arab, by drawing attention to the language used to describe the war. Typical of much of the reportage on the violence on Darfur is the following description found in a 2004 New Vision article, and New Vision is a government-owned daily newspaper in Uganda, which said, quote, "Thousands have been killed and more than 1 million black Africans have fled attacks by Arab militiamen." While the article's focus was on various AU, UN, and US pronouncements on Darfur, the only causal factor given to explain the violence is racial difference. Given the absence of any other explanatory tools for understanding the multiple sources of the violence, and most especially, as others point out, the central government's long-standing practice of marginalization, underdevelopment, and neglect of its peripheries, the reader is left to conclude that what's occurring in Darfur is a race war perpetuated by Arabs against black Africans. Racial antipathy is therefore posited as the reason why groups that historically lived, traded, intermarried, and interacted with one another for the most part in a synergistic fashion are now in the midst of a deadly war. Ironically, this dichotomy, which implicitly relies on the old trope of a geographically come racially divided Africa, that is Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Black Africa, is being used to describe a conflict in the African country that perhaps best defies, indeed obliterates, the idea of two distinct Africas. This should not be taken as a denial of Sudan's heterogeneity. After all, it is one of Africa's most linguistically, religiously, ethnically, and racially diverse countries. Rather, it is precisely this heterogeneity that flies in the face of the idea that Sudan is inhabited by two distinct, geographically bounded racial groups. And I'll just finish by saying that what I found most striking about the application of this formulation to Darfur is that it really absolves the government of its leading role in the conflict. Khartoum is regarded as a supporting actor, backing Arab militias but not directing them. And I think if we just recall the last image that we saw, where you had, the government soldier riding alongside, what would be labeled as a militiaman or janjaweed, you see the actual direct nature symbolically in that picture of the relationship between the Sudanese state and these militias that are being backed to do its bidding.
These are just some of the images by Hassan that shows really the different type of Darfuris. I mean, it's really a complex place in its own. Children refugee camps, women in the market.
I mean, can you just go back to that? I mean, this is also another interesting image because if you look at the image of the marketplace and women trading and buying and selling and doing things, these are women who come from both groups that are being seen as in the midst of a race war, right? You have in this image people who would be considered quote-unquote Arabs and people who are considered quote-unquote Black Africans. I mean, these are obviously hugely problematic categories that are being deployed very uncritically and don't take into account the everyday interactions between these groups.
And actually, this section immediately ties into some of those images when you think about them. There's a section that is about gender war and violence. Of course, in the context of civil wars and wars in general, women and children are the first victim in this case. So, and interestingly, this section is with three women scholars. One is a Dutch who works on Darfur a lot, Karin Willems, and the two others, Ruqayya Mustafa Abu Sharaf, is an anthropologist who really did a lot of research among Darfuri women, and actually her work dealt a lot with the issue in displaced people's camps around Khartoum that actually brought together Southern Sudanese, Darfuri women, and others in one space. All of them, of course, oppressed by class, but then although the reason for the displacement could be multifaceted. But it's interesting, the negotiated dynamics and other dynamics like masculinities and how it plays itself within that context. Karin also talked about that masculinity in the construction of a Sudanese national identity in the context of Darfur. Fahima Hashim is also another scholar. She's an activist. And actually, she brought a very interesting perspective to the table concerning how women are involved in Sudanese civil society to end sexual violence. And that involved really an understanding of the laws, the legal code, and the prosecution of crimes, and dealing with them on a daily basis, and also understanding the strategies that the government actually advocate, which is creating what she called gongos. We only knew NGOs, but the government introduced something as that government, non-governmental NGOs too, government, non-governmental organizations. So she introduced actually, interestingly, a very interesting new term that speaks to another phenomenon, which shows how the state is implicated here by not only instigating the violence, but by creating parallel NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that compete with the governmental organizations. So you'll be very confused about which one to work with, and all of them work on the issue of Darfur. the African Union forces.
So Section 4, Darfur Law, Human Rights and Prosecution, and I'll actually maybe just sort of bridge the two sections, the last section and this section, by saying a little bit about the contribution by Adrian Frick and Amer Hair, Sudan's legal system and the lack of access to justice for survivors of sexual violence in Darfur, which was an excellent analysis of the Sudanese legal code and practices that makes it almost impossible for women who have been raped or the victim of other forms of sexual violence to have their crimes redressed. And it's a very painstaking effort on their part to bring attention to the way in which women have to negotiate a very hostile legal system, right? So it's one thing that they're, having to negotiate a hostile environment on the ground where doing simple things like collecting water and firewood put them at risk for being sexually violated. But on top of it, when they break through any number of various sensitivities and actually seek redress for these crimes, they find it almost impossible. And not only that, but because of the way the legal code is set up, they can actually put themselves at risk if they are not able to meet these very strict and I mean they're just impossible verification standards for proving that they're raped. If they don't meet them, they can in turn be charged and fined and jailed for adultery. So it's a very hazardous sort of terrain for these women, and that particular essay does a great job of articulating that.
If I would just add that the first article, the erroneous confrontation, is also an interesting article because it brings a perspective of a very well-known Sudanese activist and very well-known lawyer in Sudan, who is actually one of the most probably brave and courageous people that I met. He is the one who defended some of the most controversial cases. I don't know if you remember the teddy bear Muhammad case of the British teacher who called the teddy bear Muhammad. So he's one of the few who managed actually in a very creative way. And what I like about his work is that he is somebody who can work from within the system, understanding the legal system that is supposedly Islamic, but he sometimes uses that from within the system. So he's an example of how you can actually, instead of leaving the country and live in exile, is stay in and manage to really engage in a creative activism that can negotiate a deterrent from within the system itself. So that's an example of even the article itself in terms of really working on the, although this is about specifically the case that led to the indictment of the president, al-Bashir of Sudan.
So this is an image after an attack. You can see the burnt out foliage and a
it's a UN.
UN camp.
Refugee camp. This is very, if you're familiar with Africa, the USAID wheat. These are the sacks that bring the food.
From the American people.
For the Sudanese civil society, this is actually also a very interesting section because it combined also Grant Farid, a scholar, who actually gave an interesting philosophical meditation. He's in the back there. Gave a very interesting meditation, a philosophical meditation on the issue of violence in relation to civil society and showing the limit of civil society in confrontation with the state. I thought it was a very interesting take on it. Musa Adam Abdul Jalil gave a very interesting, he's an anthropologist, about the role of school teachers and how sometimes you think they manage conflict, but they could also be a source of intensifying or exacerbating the violence itself. Civil society approach to Darfur is a summary of a case by Tayyib Zain Abdin, who's interestingly actually used to be part of the Islamist movement itself and now became critical. And that also shows that the effort we went through to really get even perspective of people who can be also with the government. We felt it is important to present that, but he ended up being opposed to the government itself. And Abu Bakr Muhammad Abu Bashar is from the Sudan People Liberation Army, a leading figure.
SLM, not SPLM. You said people, SLM.
Okay, Sudan Liberation Movement, Sudan Liberation Army, which is the other movement in Darfur in contrast with the Justice and Equality movement. And he talks about the failure of the Darfur peace talks in Abuja and gives a very interesting reading because he was actually a participant in the negotiation itself. And it shows how really sometimes negotiation can break down. I don't know if you want to add. No. These pictures also bring something interesting, is that we always assume that solidarity with the people of Darfur, which is great. I mean, I really believe in international, cross nations and so forth, international solidarity movement, but it sometimes glosses over the fact that inside Sudan, there are people actually protesting this. So these are just samples of some of the protest movement within Sudan itself. This is in the eastern part of Sudan, led by, in an area that is dominated by the Sudan People Liberation Army. These are people who would look very traditional to you when you look from outside. They are against the government publicly, protesting in solidarity with the people of Darfur. Young people who are involved in Darfur activism. Also, the band in the head here says, in solidarity with the people of Darfur. And the appendices.
Okay, so this will nearly bring our talk to a conclusion. So one of the things that we were really concerned about in putting this book together was to be able to provide readers with primary sources that could help them understand the conflict as it unfolded and what were sort of the various positions that the rebel movements took and other political parties within Sudan. So we made sure that we included all of those manifestos and statements. So here we have the SLM political declaration, GEM, so those being the two major rebel factions in Darfur. And then also, of course, the SPLM was very important, and they had a very well-articulated position on Darfur, which was consistent with their own activism around southern issues. And then the National Redemption Front, the Sudanese Communist Party as well. And I just want to say here that I think when you look at the fact that every single, I mean, it's obvious that the Darfuri rebel organizations are going to have position papers, but that all the other major political parties also came out, I think really shows, again, the very sort of the active involvement of local actors in trying to understand and take a position on this particular conflict, something that you really don't get if you're looking at it from outside. Do you want to talk about Abdel? Because
Abdulmunim Ajak, just to give an example of how writing in those countries is very dangerous too. He's actually one of the people that recently, after the indictment of the President al-Bashir by the International Criminal Court, he's one of the people who really tortured very badly, and he had to escape through the help of the Sudan People Liberation Army through the southern part of Sudan and end up in Uganda, and now I think he's in Ireland or England seeking treatment. But it is, after he gave us this essay for the book, he recently was arrested, tortured, and he had to leave Sudan, just to show you how risky it is to write against the government.
And we put this fact sheet together just because when you're, reading about the conflict, it can sometimes be overwhelming because there are so many different factions, and as the conflict went on, there were further fissures and then groupings that would come back together. So we wanted to be able to assist people in trying to understand this. So we created a fact sheet as well. And then Abdullahi Osman Al-Tam, who we spoke about earlier, was just absolutely fantastic in providing us with so many different documents that you otherwise could not have gotten, and also he translated many of them for us. And in particular, we took the pains of reproducing the Black Book, which was sort of very formative in Sudan itself. It was distributed sort of very covertly and then reproduced and spread by basically by hand. And it was like essentially a statistical analysis of imbalance within Sudan. And so really being able to look at how this particular conflict, again, is not, you know, what we've been told, which is this race war, but is really about a set of grievances related to Darfurians being historically marginalized by the Sudanese state, which of course is not an experience that is particular to Darfur, but is particularly exacerbated in this case.
It is also, interestingly, it's a book, from what I recall, or Shari may know this, that it was distributed, it was in Arabic, translated by Abdullah Usman al-Tom, distributed once actually in Khartoum after the Jummah, the Friday prayer. And then it disappeared for a while. Then the book surfaced after that. And there's also this very interesting document of one of the racist organizations, I must say, in the Western Sudan. It's called the Arab Gathering. And Abdullah Usman al-Tom, he had translated the document with some interventions from him, I guess.
Yep.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's all right.
So this will give you some idea that the second section, in fact, it involved more than this. It involved document by different political parties rather than the Darfur themselves from the north and from other
It also includes all of the major UN declarations, et cetera.
So let us just conclude, and I thank you really for sitting through this by just saying a few words, reading from our own conclusion here, is that the process of editing this volume on Darfur, like the conference that preceded it, raises a fundamental question concerning our personal, moral, and political stand in relation to our responsibility as academics, engaged in seeking a reasonable level of scholarly objectivity and truth. We realized from the beginning the need for rigorous analysis and understanding of the root causes of the violence in Darfur. However, we are also very clear that our objective is not to engage in an endless intellectual exercise that may help deconstruct the crisis, but stop short of taking a clear stand on the issues at stake. Rather, we believe that such an exercise, coupled with a clear moral and political stand on issues of injustice, is the first step towards a lasting solution to the problem. There is no doubt in our mind that the conflict in Darfur is about resistance to the injustices inflicted upon the people of Darfur, rooted in a state-sanctioned policy of marginalization, compounded by years of neglect and disregard for Darfurians' right to access their share of national wealth, to partake in the development of the region, and to share power at every level of governance. This has been exacerbated by the NIF government, which instead of righting the wrongs, has resorted to a set of horrific counterinsurgency policies, including scorched tactics, murder, rape, and other forms of gender-based violence, which in addition to their immediate impact, has led to the massive displacement of millions of Darfurians and the destruction of their livelihood over the last 5 years. As in the case of apartheid South Africa, one does not need to live in Darfur to realize the horrific crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing that Darfurians of specific ethnicities have been subjected to. In Darfur, justice has been delayed for too long. Justice needs to be served. As such, our engagement is motivated by a search for truth in service of justice, by engaging Sudanese voices, and more specifically, the voices of Darfurians. Accordingly, in soliciting contribution to this book, we tried our best to involve a diverse array of Sudanese scholars and civil society activists. Avoiding the pitfalls of naive authenticity, we engage other scholars beyond Sudan, whose experience and knowledge of Darfur and Sudanese affairs have further strengthened the volume contents. Finally, we tried as much as possible not to interfere with the content of the essays, including instances in which we disagreed with some of the views expressed by our contributors. In the end, we must emphasize that opinions expressed in this volume are the contributing author's responsibility, not ours, except for, of course, our own text. And I end by this disclaimer. So thank you so much. So if you have questions, issues you want to raise? Sure.
Yeah, congrats. It's always nice to see the work coming out. But you mentioned, Carina, that Mandani was heavily attacked, and I just wanted to get a sense of, is he the only one who was attacked like that? And then what was the nature and what were his responses?
Yeah, attack is maybe too strong of a word. I would say really heavily and critically engaged. You know, because I think that at that moment in time, which was really a year and a half ago or 2 years, getting close to 2 years ago, he was, you know, really at the sort of beginning stages of what would become saviors and survivors. And so I think a lot of the people at the conference felt that he was, well, I can say for sure, one of the major critiques was that they felt that in some ways he absolved the Sudanese government his work could be read as absolving the Sudanese government in the sense that some people read it as sort of saying that, you know, Save Darfur movement is making a mountain out of molehill, and it's, you know, really not that serious. And so, of course, you know, you have, you know, the GEM leadership there, you have the SLM leadership there, and they really took him on. They were like, yes, this is really serious. And we need to be concerned about how this is getting read. Of course, Mamdani, and he still sticks by this position, is, you know, I can't be concerned about what the, you know, how you know, Omar al-Bashir is going to use, you know, my writing. I need to be true to the facts as I understand them. And so that was sort of his defense. But he was very much, I think, engaged. And I think he, you know, or I hope he found it helpful. I don't know if you want to add to that.
What I would add really, of course, Mamdani's book is, you know, it's not a book that is free of faults and some misgivings. I think his major problem, I mean, he's really great at analyzing the politics of humanitarianism, especially within the new global order. And he tried to alert the audience there not to be naive about foreign intervention. And his major point is that this whole advocacy of a UN force, and of course his work focused on critiquing the earlier effort to bring in the AU, and he felt the African Union forces are a great step to be involved in the sense it's a great step for an African intervention in an African problem. And he advocated this idea of an African solution for African problems. But then he said when there is a kind of almost deliberate act to undermine the African Union forces and to replace that with the UN, he felt that was the Save Darfur strategy, which just will lead to a permanent occupation with no strategy for solution. Of course, and then he went on really to criticize what he called now in his book, this humanitarian fundamentalism that takes up the cause without really worry about the long-term consequences of their intervention, with no vision for a permanent solution. Because specifically, we really dedicated the book to the Sudanese people by insisting on also pointing to the idea of a united, democratic, I may add also secular Sudan. Because the major issue is that what is it that we want to achieve, or what does this movement want to achieve by intervention in Sudan? Is it really maintaining a Sudan that is democratic? And because that's not the case. Because they don't have any vision of that. So Mamdani ended up in the process of critiquing what he called humanitarian fundamentalism, underestimate the role of the state, which is what some Sudanese scholars in the conference tried to alert him to it, is that if you really live inside Sudan, you will understand that is, yes, there are all these those environmental, long history, that yes, the so-called Arabs are not foreigners to Darfur, all of that kind of is right. But don't underestimate the role of the state, and specifically this fundamentalist state, this Islamic state military, because it definitely, is responsible for what happened and for actually really accelerating the problem rather than resolving it. So that's what I will just add. Yes?
So this is not about the book, because I haven't read the book yet. A question something I've often wondered about. 9/11 changed the world, and we got terrible U.S. occupations of Afghanistan and then Iraq. What would have happened if Osama had not left the Sudan, had been sitting in the Sudan when 9/11 took place, and the U.S. aid demanded that the Sudanese government give him up or invaded the Sudan? What do you think would have happened?
One scenario is that we will be Afghanistan. But I'm not sure whether we will end up in the same situation as in other countries, because I think Sudan is not Afghanistan, and if I must predict, is that I think it would have been more disastrous for the American than Afghanistan, because they wouldn't be really turn into like a long occupation force, because Sudan has a very well-developed political movement and civil society that could really oppose the occupation or find ways of resisting it better than the Taliban, which is, their strategies really, in a way, will end up prolonging this, because they have no strategy for or a vision for an alternative Afghanistan that one could agree with. That's one scenario. But I think what really happened in Sudan with bin Laden is one have to realize that it is an evidence of the implication of the United States in the policies that led to this kind of blowbacks, or whatever you call it, the September 11, is that they actually financed Osama bin Laden. Sudan was a key station for fundamentalist transit route to Pakistan and then to Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden, with the knowledge of the Americans, was operating on that kind of, in the past. He's the one who's, in very important in the recruitment of Islamists to fight Afghanistan against Russia. But then later on, as they say, the chicken come home to roost. And what happened is that he actually moved from Saudi Arabia with the knowledge of the American. And in Khartoum, he was actually living publicly. I mean, Oshari, you are in Sudan. I think the movement of Osama bin Laden, if the United States was really interested in getting rid of him at the time, it would have been very easy in Khartoum rather than, but all what they did is that they pressured Sudan to let him go. And he traveled publicly through the airport in Khartoum to Pakistan and then end up in Afghanistan. So I think it's just more evidence to the implication of the role of the United States policies in the past in basically creating what we see now, as Islamic terror and all of those terminologies that come to speak about. So, any other questions? Shari, you have no questions? Okay, well, thank you so much. And there is a reception.